to stand there?
No. You do your thing.
Okay, I'll do my
It'll
thing
take
here.
care of things.
So, very timely moment to be talking about this. Let me start by saying I'm not in my talk going to address any of the particular cases, bring up whatever ones you want to bring up in question and answers. I won't go more than 35 or 40 minutes, so we should have a lot of time for that. I'll just say, to me, those recent decisions range from the dubious to the wildly overstated to the totally insane, or what the Brits call barking mad. But I thought it would be a better use of our time not to make this a moot court session where I practice the arguments that somebody better qualified than me could be giving, but just to give you a kind of overview of how did we get here. Old textbooks on international law, by old I mean from the 1970s, used to start with a few pages of, well, a lot of people are skeptical about international law, and then they give you these quotations. Frederick the Great said, "First, I took the territory I wanted, then I found scholars to say it was my legal right to do so." So that's one view. And you'd have a bunch of these, and then you'd get this statement from Abba Eban, who was Israel's first ambassador to the UN and later foreign minister. And unlike Frederick the Great, he made a really insightful, penetrating summary of international law. International law is that law which the wicked do not obey and the righteous do not enforce. That is so good, I will repeat it. International law is that law which the wicked do not obey and the righteous do not enforce. This is a preview to my talk. Palestinian leaders have always taken the first part for granted. They don't need to obey international law. They have not adequately reckoned with the second part of that summary regarding the conduct of the righteous. Israel's in trouble with international law from the convergence of two trends that have gathered momentum in the past 3 decades or so. First, a lot of people have come to develop a much more ambitious or otherworldly view of what international law is or could be. And second, this has happened in an environment which has become increasingly more skeptical or hostile to Israel. These two things together have generated the idea that the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, anybody can force Israel to do what the Palestinians want. Really, to make this clear to you, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what international law used to be, and I do this not out of nostalgia, but because what it used to be is actually really what it still is, which is a very imperfect body of law, which is a mix of diplomacy and politics with legal arguments. We came to call international law really emerged in the mid-17th century after the 30 Years' War in Europe, which is a war between the Catholic empires and the smaller Protestant states, at the end of which there's a general peace, the Peace of Westphalia, in which the Catholic empires acknowledge, okay, the Netherlands, you're on your own. Switzerland, you're on your own. Sweden, okay, you're on your own. Anything the Pope says is not binding on you. Anything the Holy Roman Emperor says is not binding on you. So it starts, writing on international law starts in a period in which there's a lot of emphasis on state sovereignty. And the corollary to that is states are only bound when they give consent to be bound by a particular standard. The most characteristic doctrine of international law as it developed was the doctrine of neutrality, which already today seems a little like, but In medieval times, the notion was, which has a certain intuitive moral appeal, everybody should help when there has been wrongdoing, and you should help the aggrieved party. When there is aggression, everyone should help the victim. And this was the official doctrine of the Crusades. Everybody should help. A really telling, revealing thing about the Crusades, they were originally proclaimed by popes, and then they drew in all the crowned heads of Europe who thought like, oh, I guess we're doing that, oh, yeah, we have to do that. I mean, they didn't all do it at the same time, and they didn't all do it very effectively, but they thought they could be drawn into a struggle which had actually nothing to do with France or England or Germany, because it was presented as we have to defend the Christians in the Holy Land. The Enlightenment doctrine was really the opposite, which was every state needs to look after itself. Its first duty is to the security of its own people. So if there is a war out there, that's too bad. It might be that one side seems like more the aggressor than the other, but you don't have to get involved because they're fighting and you can keep yourself safe. The United States, which came into existence with a classic statement of Enlightenment doctrine in the Declaration of Independence, took this view. It's our choice whether we do or do not get into foreign wars. And for 150 years, we stayed out of wars in Europe. When we fought European powers, we did it one at a time. We didn't seek for allies, and we didn't get involved in anyone else's wars. Even in the world wars of the 20th century, we came late to both of them because our initial instinct was, we don't have to be in this if we don't want to. So you could ask if countries can resort to war at their choice, stay out of it at their choice, go into it at their choice. What is the point of international law? There was a point, which was you don't want to get into a war out of misunderstanding. There were rules, for example, about the duties of neutral states. They could trade with both sides in a war, but they shouldn't assist one side in a war by giving them arms or giving them bases. The United States disregarded this obligation of neutrality in 1940, 1941. President Roosevelt accepted the risk. He may have welcomed the risk that this would provoke Germany to say, wait, you're not really being neutral. So he was willing to take that risk. He thought it was important to support Britain. We did not follow the traditional rules that had been generally accepted about what a neutral should do. We are at the present time giving a lot of aid to Ukraine. I'm totally in favor of that. It's great. We should be doing that. I read an interesting article by a German professor of international law, who I have to say seemed like a nice person, but had this like German obsession with, oh, this might be against the rules. And so he had a whole elaborate argument about why this was an exception and it was really okay to do this. There were generally rules. Sometimes you decided it was more important to do something else and you took the risk that, okay, we're violating the rules and somebody else might retaliate, but we have to do what we think is required by our safety. After the American Civil War, there was a famous arbitration between Britain and the United States, and we complained, hey, you gave, in effect, aid to the Confederate States. You built raiding ships for them, and they did a lot of damage, and Britain, after this arbitration, agreed, oh, okay, yes, we will pay you. The arbitrators decided they ought to pay this amount in compensation, which in the mid-19th century was $15 million, a lot of money. And that was a celebrated thing, and it was copied in many other situations. There were disputes, and then it was agreed to submit the dispute to arbitration. I'm mentioning this because after a while there were a lot of these, and treatise writers would analyze them and report them. So you get to have a sense that, there is more established international law because you have all these judgments. But arbitration was never compulsory, and being arbitration, the understanding was this will settle our dispute. It's not necessarily a precedent, and it happened commonly that there would be an arbitration ruling in a particular dispute, and a later arbitration panel would say, actually, we don't think that's right, or we don't think it applies here. States sometimes would just say, well, we don't agree to submit this to arbitration, it's too important. Anyway, we disagree. If they did agree, they would not only choose the judges that they wanted, the jurists, they would carefully define these issues and not those issues. So they developed this practice of some things can be submitted to something like a judicial process, but it's at the choice of states and with all kinds of limitations. I mean, this was helpful in developing standards for a whole lot of things, the treatment of ambassadors, the treatment of foreign nationals, foreign ships. There are a lot of things that became increasingly standardized. But countries still reserve the right to say, no, arbitration won't be enough. War. The United States State Department published, starting in the late 19th century, Digest of International Law, they called it. Eventually they changed the name to Digest of U.S. Practice in International Law, which is a more accurate title, because what they were actually presenting was, this is the United States view of what international law is, because our president has said such and such on this issue, or our attorney general has, or congressional resolution has said this. And implicitly it was saying, you might disagree, too bad, this is our view, and we hold to this view. And if we get into a dispute, you know in advance. We might compromise, we might bargain with you, we might even go to arbitration, but we start with, we have our view. You might think the United Nations has displaced all this, not really. The UN Charter established a permanent court of international justice, which sounds really imposing, but actually it's kind of like a fancier version of arbitration. It only hears now like 2 or 3 cases a year, not many cases. States are reluctant to go there. They can still do their own arbitration on the side. The jurisdiction usually requires the consent of both parties, so if either state says no, then it's no. It's only states, by the way. The statute of this Court of Justice stipulates its rulings are only binding on the parties in that dispute. They're not binding precedents. So the United States, from the beginning, we were particularly insistent on this. You're not building up a common law of the world. If we bring a dispute there, it's for that dispute. And when the Senate agreed to this, they said, by the way, we're only giving general agreement to disputes that involve bilateral relations, not the interpretation of multilateral treaties. What's the objection to interpreting multilateral treaties? And I believe what they were most concerned about was the UN Charter. We basically reserve the right to say the UN Charter means what we think it's supposed to mean, and not what this court might be tempted to say they think it means. So this is important because the Charter says, and we accept, states are prohibited from using force to resolve disputes, except in self-defense. The United States has a much more, let's say, expansive interpretation of what that means than many other countries do, and we say, fine, you don't use force. We have 12 aircraft carriers, we have a different view. The court, even when it was asked to give advisory opinions, which is provided in the statute, the General Assembly, a few other organs can ask it to give advice, which is what's recently happened with Israel and the occupied territories. It had a lot of doctrines which were based on the idea that you shouldn't wade into a highly contentious political dispute. For example, this is something the Security Council is dealing with. So you never heard much about the International Court of Justice. Older people here who remember all the debates we had about the war in Vietnam, how come we never heard from the International Court of Justice about that? And some later episodes, we never heard from them because we didn't agree to be sued by them. And on the rare occasion when somehow they invoked jurisdiction, this famous example is Nicaragua in 1984. They said the United States was wrong to be aiding the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration just said, well, that's your opinion. We didn't think you should have had jurisdiction. We're not listening. That's it. And that was it. We continued with our policy, and the Contras were overthrown, and nothing happened. Just a little footnote, the new government asked for our aid, and we said, happy to aid, send you a lot of money to help you, but you have to repudiate the decision of the International Court of Justice and say, we're not giving you this money to honor that opinion because we repudiate that opinion. Easier to do if you're a big power, but the United States is not unique in refusing to go along with decisions of the International Court of Justice. I just remind you now to come up almost to today. 2022, Russia got involved in a dispute or was sued by Ukraine. Ukraine invoked the genocide treaty. Russia said, we're not listening, we have jurisdiction. They made the same kind of protest. The court said, well, you have to withdraw from Ukraine. This made no impression on President Putin. And that was the end of that. So this is not a real powerful, important body. International law, where it most matters, remains a mix of legal arguments with diplomacy and threats of force. We live in a world that's not so different from the world before 1945. So you might ask, how could anyone think otherwise? There's so many examples of aggression, violence, abuse. At this very moment, there's a civil war, if you want to call it that, in Sudan. It's basically rival warlords. Many, many more people have been killed there than in Gaza, for much less reason. I mean, it just seems to be which warlord will end up controlling the treasury there. Why don't we get the International Court of Justice on that right away and tell the wrong warlords to step down and promote the good one? I think everybody realizes that would just be completely pointless and humiliating to the International Court of Justice. Nothing good would come from that. It's just hopeless. I mean, they have to fight it out, sorry. Why would anyone think it would be different in the Mideast? So I want to talk for a few minutes about what happened after the end of the Cold War. Again, older people remember this. It was not really expected. It was rather sudden. It was rather remarkable. Suddenly, the Soviet Empire collapsed. The very same year that happened, the Soviet Union dissolved itself. The European Community, the Common Market, relaunched as the European Union. And over the next 2 decades, it embraced more and more new members. Eventually got up to 27 countries that had been in the Soviet Empire are now in the EU. Former neutrals like Sweden and Finland and Austria joined. And just to remind you, well, everyone sort of knows, the EU does not have an army, it does not have a police force, it does not even have an administrative field force, it does not even have a criminal court. It has a bureaucracy that sends out directives, and it has this one central court of justice, which hears appeals from national courts, and then national courts implement it, and somehow this mostly works. So if you're a European, you start to think, wow, you can settle disputes by law because Germany and France are living happily together with Finland and Portugal and Malta and now Estonia and Latvia. Who would have thought? In the same period, starting in the 1990s, the European Court of Human Rights, which is a different institution and it has more members than the EU, also got more confident and more activist. They started telling Britain, you have to stop doing these anti-terror measures in Northern Ireland. They admonished the British Army, your infantry behaved abusively in Iraq. You have to pay damages to Iraqi civilians. I mean, they basically looked at like, oh, it didn't seem like you had a good enough reason. This could never happen in America. That the United States courts would follow the American army to remote battlefields. The European Court of Human Rights thought this was an okay thing to do. People in Britain were really indignant about this, said we should withdraw, but they didn't. So that gives you a sense of like, yes, courts can do amazing things. In the 1990s, starting actually in the 1980s, a whole bunch of military dictatorships in Latin America gave way to elected democracies. This happened also in Africa. The apartheid regime in South Africa gave way to a multiracial, multi-party democracy. People in the 1990s were very optimistic about what international law could do, and they thought they had good reasons to think that. Although most of that was developments, if I could say, to use a non-technical term, in nice countries. The culmination of this in 1998 was a conference established an international criminal court. This wasn't totally out of the blue. Back in 1948, the UN sponsored this convention on the punishment of the crime of genocide, and they said everyone will be responsible under these circumstances for the punishment for having trials. Unless there is an international tribunal, this was just a few years after Nuremberg, they thought like, yeah, there could be an international tribunal that would do this. And then we were totally overwhelmed by the Cold War, and everyone thought, no, that would be crazy. There can't be a court which is going to judge between the United States and the Soviet Union and whatever conflicts we have. So that was just sidelined for many decades. But in 1998, they thought, no, actually, no, we can do this. Yes, let's do this. In 2010, they actually extended its jurisdiction to cover the crime of aggression. So in principle, if there's a war, there are a whole lot of qualifications, jurisdictional limitations, but in principle, the idea of this was, if there's a war, the International Criminal Court could decide who is responsible and who should be punished. But it should maybe also punish the other side for fighting in a way, even though they are the victims of aggression, for not fighting in a fair way. People in all previous history would have thought this was like crazy, because it is kind of crazy, and it had the immediate effect, the immediate implication of these things that won't necessarily have to be decided by the Security Council, where there's a great power veto. So we displace the Security Council, and these things can be decided by this court. President Clinton signed this to show that he was a good guy, and then declined to submit it to the Senate to show he was not crazy. John Bolton, who was then Assistant Secretary of State for, I think, actually arms control, persuaded President Bush to unsign. This was like my one moment of personal contact with history. He called me up and said, what do you think is the procedure for unsigning? But I had to tell him, I never heard of this. He said, no one else has heard of this either, but we're going to do this. So he wrote a letter to Kofi Annan. We're never going to ratify this. Cross us off the list of people you're waiting to have ratified. Israel did this. They also signed because like Nuremberg, they're in favor of international justice, and then they like looked around and thought, no. Russia signed, amazingly, and then they also realized, no, that's crazy. No, we're not. Yeah. So there's now like 120 countries out of about 200 in the UN, which sounds kind of impressive, but they're like all the countries that figure they will never be fighting a war themselves. A majority of the Security Council of the permanent members has said, no, thank you, no. China says, we don't want to be part of this. Russia says, we don't want to be part of this. The United States Germany was very keen on it. Like other people should be tried for war crimes. They browbeat the French browbeat the British. They were all a little queasy about this. Because it meant, among other things, giving up their Security Council veto as protection. But they were persuaded, oh, there are all these safeguards. It's only for crimes the most serious crimes of international concern. Not every little thing that might be technically, only the most serious crimes. And only when the official comes from a state which is unable or unwilling to undertake its own prosecution. This hasn't actually worked out well at all, because even though there are 120 countries that say they're willing to cooperate, they don't cooperate. It's not only the righteous that don't cooperate, it's also the not so righteous that don't cooperate. In its first 20 years, the ICC had 35 people indicted. Which is kind of amazing. In the whole world, 35. And a third of them did not show up, amazingly, and were not arrested. The ICC doesn't have police, so it's just hanging out there waiting for them to show up. And then they fumbled the prosecutions in more than half of the cases. They went on for years, and they were either acquitted or they withdrew the prosecution because they didn't have the right evidence. There were like many things that were. Their conviction rate is about 40%, which you would be fired as a normal prosecutor if that's the best you did. And the average sentence is less than 20 years. So these are the most terrible crimes. They're not that bad because, I mean, they're sorry and won't do it again. 10 years would be enough. This is not an important court either. Everybody so far convicted has been from Africa. Now let's talk just for a bit about Israel. We've gotten used to the idea that, of course, Israel is a very unpopular state and it's always battling to maintain itself. This was actually not always true. Israel declared its independence in May of 1948, which was a year after the term Cold War had already been coined. So it was really born into the Cold War. Nonetheless, President Truman recognized it immediately, but only de facto, meaning like after you're a little better organized and show that you're in place. We will have full exchange of ambassadors, but we, in principle, recognize you. Stalin waited another 2 days and said, we'll top that. We're ready to send an ambassador. We don't know what you mean by better organized. Not everyone can be as well organized as the Soviet Union. The more striking thing is they were admitted to the UN, to full membership in the UN in less than a year. You might think like, well, once you're out there, of course the UN would like bring you in. No, that's not true. If you compare Israel's experience to other countries which had disputed borders or some like surrounding political dispute, Ireland was not admitted, little peaceful little Ireland was not admitted until 1955. West Germany was not admitted until 1973. Because, there's East Germany, which of them? Well, I mean, it seemed like it was complicated. And South Korea was not admitted until 1991. Because again, there's North Korea, so it's complicated. In 1949, the UN was like, yeah, Israel, okay, yeah, there's some questions, but I mean, sure, okay. One other amazing thing, in 1952, the General Assembly elected as its vice president Abba Eban, delegate from Israel, because he seemed like he spoke really well and knew a lot about law and everything. And was like, sure, yeah, and it wasn't even controversial. What went wrong? Arab states remained implacably hostile. The Soviet Union shifted its position to sort of court the sympathies of Arab countries. There got to be more Arab countries. There got to be more new countries. Former colonies joined the UN and then became a majority. They organized themselves as the non-aligned movement. We're not communist. We're not with the West, but actually they were mostly against the West because the West were their former colonizers, and the West had the capital that I thought was being unfairly withheld from them, and had the force. So you can see just in the numbers, the Islamic Conference came to embrace 57 member states. The non-aligned movement eventually got up to 120 members, so practically a majority of the members of the non-aligned movement are Muslim states, and they are a very solid majority of UN membership. So resolutions sponsored by Arab countries are likely to get a very sympathetic hearing from the General Assembly, particularly when the Soviet Union was there saying like, yeah, we're for that too, yeah. So the culmination of a lot of agitation was in 1975. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution denouncing Zionism as racism. I want to call your attention to two things about this. As late as 1975, they didn't mention the occupied territories. They weren't talking about the occupied territories. They'd be like, Israel is based on a racist doctrine. That's what they were going for. Israel should not exist in any form because it's racist. Every country in Western Europe, including ones which later on became rather unfriendly, like Ireland and Norway, said, like, we're against that. Every Western country understood that this was the Soviet Union trying to roll over a Western country, and they all voted against it. No, they were outvoted, but it shows you where this was. During the Cold War, it was much easier to rally support of Western countries for Israel. Then the Soviet Union had to withdraw from Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War. In 1991, President Bush, the first President Bush, mobilized support at the UN to revoke, that was the term, not repudiate, just revoke the Zionism is racism resolution. The Soviet Union, one of its last official acts before it became defunct, said like, oh yeah, we vote to revoke that too. Yeah, sorry, that was never mind. And then they faded away. So the Palestinians were left without Soviet support, and a lot of countries that had been in this non-aligned movement said, oh, President Bush, you're king of the world now. There's no Soviet Union. Okay, whatever you say, revoke, yes. Okay, yes. And we start to have these negotiations with the Palestinians. This is a big come down for Yasser Arafat to be negotiating, because his position had been there shouldn't be Israel and all of it should be returned to the Palestinians. It's a big deal to get him to negotiate. This is for sure a sense of weakness and being cornered. And then he eventually negotiates the Oslo Accords in 1993, which is self-government in Palestinian territories in first a few areas and then larger areas. Both the Bush administration and the follow-on Clinton administration had pushed hard for these kind of negotiations. In 2000, when the Clinton administration thought it was about to clinch a final agreement between Palestinians and Israel, Arafat just said no and started the second intifada. By 2000, they didn't have the Soviet Union, but by then they had international human rights advocacy groups. New arguments were developed, and this is where these trends converge. We start to have advocacy groups like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty International. They hadn't existed before the 1970s. I think Advocacy International started in 1967. And Human Rights Watch in 1975, something like that. I mean, they're somewhat late on the scene, and it took them a while to realize that a kind of thing that a lot of people would like to hear about is Israeli abuses in the occupied territories. A lot of European governments are interested in this because they thought if we put enough pressure on Israel, they'll go back to bargaining, there'll be a settlement, then there'll be peace. The EU can do this. The EU especially can do this, it thinks, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, because the US is too associated with Israel, and the EU can be, we're a friend of the Palestinians. So there get to be a whole lot of people with a whole lot of opinions about what should happen there and what international law requires, and people come to have this exaggerated idea of what can be settled by international law. Every year there's another half dozen resolutions of the UN General Assembly insisting Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and of Gaza, and of the, sometimes they remember to mention the Golan Heights, is unlawful and has to end. Now, the General Assembly does not have the authority under the UN Charter to decide what any country's boundaries are. It has almost no authority. The only thing it can decide is the budget of the UN. So these are not in themselves international law, but they repeat them. There gets to be this notion that, well, since they've repeated it so many times, and since Israel sort of admitted implicitly that it's going to make a deal, that means it admits that it isn't really in those territories and it shouldn't be in those territories. In 2004, the International Court of Justice gave an advisory opinion that Israel couldn't build defensive barriers, the so-called wall, because it was doing this to protect settlements, so it was somewhat beyond the green line, the 1948 boundary. As late as 2004, the EU, along with the United States and Canada and actually Russia, actually filed statements with the International Court of Justice. Don't get into this. This is not for you. There's negotiations ongoing, or we hope to resume negotiations. Don't complicate this by saying what the boundaries are. And in 2004, the International Court of Justice said, we were asked by the General Assembly to give advice. We're going to tell you what we think. So that is all the prelude to what we've experienced in the last year. In January, the International Court of Justice held in a suit by South Africa that the South African government had shown enough evidence that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. That, I mean, they didn't say it's correct. They said, we can't dismiss this. And by the way, Israel, you should stop doing whatever might be genocide. My friends who follow these things more closely said to me that Israel got off pretty lightly because they didn't actually tell Israel to do anything. But still, as the International Court of Justice put the word genocide in play. In July, the International Court of Justice handed out another advisory opinion holding Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem illegal. Okay. And this week, the International Criminal Court said, yes, the prosecutor wants to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister. Yes, we approve these arrest warrants. None of these things, I think, by themselves require Israel to do anything. Probably it requires Netanyahu to check his travel schedule and check with host countries, like, are you really going to arrest me? But Hungary has already said no, they will never arrest him. So that's a good place to visit, also America. Let me just conclude. The Jewish world is very concerned about escalating expressions of hostility to Israel, particularly in the past year, and to Jews in the past year, since the war in Gaza started. Of course, people are right to be concerned. I'm not at all deprecating that. I do think we sort of lose sight of how this looks to the other side, how this looks to the Palestinians and their advocates. In all of Israel's previous wars, they struck an effective blow, and then the international community, that is the Security Council, that is the United States and the Soviet Union and Britain and France, okay, that's enough. Don't go any deeper into Egypt. Stop fighting. Don't go any deeper into Syria. That's enough. Okay, stop. And as you know, that in previous wars, that came into play on the 6th day or after 3 weeks, but in very short time, because major powers thought we can't have all of this turmoil. and I think historically it was, Soviet clients can't be totally humiliated. If you're on the Palestinian side, or if you're on the Islamist side, you have to be just astonished that the war in Gaza has been allowed to continue now for more than a year. They have launched a global intifada. There's mobs in London every week. There's tent camps in Harvard Yard and in all these other university campuses. There are all these disruptions in Chicago and San Francisco and New York, around the world. There's all this noise, there's all this commotion, there's all this denunciation. The street is indignant everywhere. And Israel just continues, fighting, and nothing happens. And they're like, wait, stop, no, this can't go on. No, wait, stop. We're going to the International Criminal Court. We're going to the International Court of Justice. International law will stop you. As I said at the beginning, they forgot the second part of Abba Eban's really great statement. It's international law is that law that does not constrain the righteous and does not force the righteous to enforce it. Just this past week, something I think in its own way more momentous than the arrest warrants didn't get a lot of attention. I'm sorry Mark Mellman is not here, but tell him I said it. He deserves a lot of credit. Very good work, Mark. There was a Security Council resolution, ceasefire in Gaza. That really is enough. They previously said release the hostages and have a ceasefire. This time they just said, okay, it's too late to talk about hostages. Just stop it. And everybody in the Security Council said yes, just stop it. But the Biden administration said, no, we're not agreeing to that, no. So where are we? The arrest warrants, it's sad. It shows the International Court of Justice is kind of ridiculous institution, and it's made itself more ridiculous. I think there's almost no chance that there will be arrests following on it, which is a typical experience for them. The Republicans in the Senate said, okay, we're going to have sanctions. I don't know if you followed this closely enough. In 2019 or 20, the International Court of Justice announced that it was going to investigate possible U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. And President Trump said, okay, we're going to impose sanctions on the ICC. And we're not fooling around with the ICC as an institution. We're getting the names of the judges who are involved, of the prosecutors, of the people on their staff. They can't come to America. And as a next step, we're going to freeze any assets they have in the United States. And they said, you can't do this. This is an outrage. And then a few months later, they said, actually, this is not a priority, so we're not going to be actually actively pursuing this. I think they have in mind much more severe sanctions. I think they are very likely to be effective. We may see a confrontation between The Hague and Washington. I would not bet on The Hague to prevail in such a confrontation. Among other things, the real base of support for the International Criminal Court are the European states who created it. It was their idea, and they fund it. And they mostly have been muttering about this. They haven't said, yes, we salute the court and we will do everything we can to see this implemented. They've been really mostly very kind of awkward and embarrassed about this. What they are very concerned about is that the Trump administration will abandon Ukraine, or that it will in general abandon NATO, and it doesn't have to abandon either of them to make Europeans very, very anxious about what's coming. That if you are very worried about Russian aggression in your neighborhood, it's not reassuring at all to know the International Criminal Court will be ready to back us up. That actually turns out in real life to be nothing. And it isn't even reassuring to know that there'll be General Assembly resolutions, or there'll be decisions of the International Court of Justice. So I think Europeans will be very attentive to the Trump administration saying maybe you'd like to revoke those arrest warrants the way the General Assembly was persuaded to revoke its Zionism is racism resolution. Let me say one last thing and then you can ask me about anything. We should not ignore that much of the world, whatever they say at the UN, is really very relieved that Israel's dealt such decisive blows to Hamas and Hezbollah. Arab states have done almost nothing to support Hamas and Hezbollah. There's a lot they might have done that would really complicate things for Israel. European states have done almost nothing to inhibit Israel's continuing war efforts. No state has imposed trade sanctions. Britain and Canada both said they're going to suspend certain categories of arms shipments, and those are really token gestures. They're not trying very hard to help Hamas or Hezbollah. I believe when the dust settles, Israel will be safer for having defended itself. Arguments from international law will not count for much. Israel has its own serious, credible legal arguments, very capable legal advocates. The current conflicts will be settled, as most conflicts are settled, not by decrees from some international court, but by compromise among the parties to the conflicts. Jews have not survived for so many centuries by bowing to what might have seemed the dominant opinions of other nations. In Devarim, months from now we'll get to it, Moshe Rabbeinu assures the Israelites if they adhere to their own law, other nations will say, Rak am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh. What a wise and understanding people is this great nation. I think all over the Arab world and all throughout Europe, there are people saying that in their various languages, like, wow, you sold them the pages and they exploded and then you decimated their lead. That was fantastic. But I remind you, Moshe Rabbeinu does not say there, all nations will say this or they'll all say it at the same time. The point is, many will come to notice over time, and this will be a help to the people of Israel. Israel has friends, it has powerful friends, they will count for a lot. And international law is a thing which historically countries understood they had to argue about and bargain about. It is not settled by one Supreme Court of the world, because we don't have a one Supreme Court of the world, because we do not have a world government like that. This probably makes for a safer and better world, but right now it surely makes for a safer Israel. That is as much as I wanted to say about the sort of overview. But if you want to ask me about why is Israel not doing genocide, or why does it have claims to East Jerusalem, I can give you short statements on every one of those good topics, because I have read what Israel's lawyers have to say. He has 12 questions. Yeah, okay, just two.
Two questions. When everyone says Israel has a right to defend itself,
yeah,
what does that mean? And the second question is, we're no longer in an era where, like Battle of Waterloo or Gettysburg, where redcoats are shooting at blue coats or whatever, civilians get killed, starting with World War I, where the British starved the Germans into submission, World War II, where the United States firebombed Japan, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. What does it mean?
Yeah.
What civilian casualty?
A very short answer is this is disputed. And part of what we're talking about is, can the International Criminal Court say the correct understanding of the international standards is the following? I'll give you just one example. Part of the, I'm calling it indictment, it's technically not an indictment, but the sort of bill of particulars leading up to the arrest warrant from the ICC was, Israel is trying to starve people in Gaza. Now, everyone has pretty much accepted, okay, you really shouldn't do that, although there is a very prominent legal authority in Israel who thinks actually that's not clearly against international law, but Israel's not arguing that. Its very good point is, like, has anyone died yet from starvation? And even the people who are saying you're trying to starve don't actually have, like, oh yes, they're talking about a handful of people, maybe. A handful is almost like, who knows what maybe they were really sick. Probably they were really sick already. It hasn't actually followed through on limiting supplies to such an extent that people are starving. They did, at the beginning of the war, people in Netanyahu's cabinet said, maybe Gallant said, we'll just shut off everything, and we'll start. I mean, he said it, he was angry. They didn't actually do it. I think there's a lot of complicated legal questions, if you really are determined to get into them, about can you show intent from a statement if it is not followed up by clear action afterwards, or highly disputed action afterwards. There's a lot of questions that could be raised about the prohibition, which everyone accepts, against starvation. Does this mean you can squeeze people up to the point that they drop dead, or does it mean, no, you really have to make sure they have, the FDA-approved food group, the whole pyramid, and fresh greens and other colorful salad? I mean, you could have a serious debate about this if you wanted to be serious. I think it's a threshold question, which is what Israel argued. Like, seriously, in the whole world, this is the thing you're focusing on? Because it's now really kind of speculative and secondary. I mean, this is not a high death toll from the starvation.
But what about the bombings?
So the bombings is also that, right? So there's this question, if people are hiding behind civilian shields, how much obligation does the attacker have to say, we can't reach you because that would involve hurting civilians? The Red Cross claims there should never be large number of civilian casualties. I mean, that's in their commentary on one of the relevant war.
Who cares what the Red Cross is?
That is an excellent question. The Red Cross is not a party to this.
But it's the authorized interpreter.
Well, no, it is not the authorized. It is the self-appointed interpreter. I don't know what authorized means. What is authorized in the treaty is that they can provide services as a go-between. It is not said, I don't think we would have agreed to this. Yeah, please follow up with me. I'll be interested. I don't believe it's correct. I don't even know what authorized interpreter means. If by authorized you mean definitive, authoritative, absolutely not. No. I mean, it provides service, taxi service in particular, to deliver hostages. But anyway, it's a very fair question. It's a very fair question. Who cares what they think? I'll just tell you because it's like a fun fact, which is that when the United States went to the Geneva Convention of 1927, I think, which was to develop a new convention to protect prisoners of war, the State Department said the Red Cross is not to be allowed to participate in this, even though it was in Geneva, because the Red Cross asked people to come to Geneva. They are not a state. They won't be a signatory. They won't take prisoners. They won't protect prisoners. They have to stand on the sidelines. So we were very mindful of that in the 1920s, and it was not silly. I mean, who are they? Right? If they're not another state that's entering into the bargain, they look like they're the brooding omnipresence in the sky that instructs everyone on justice, and we didn't sign up for that. So, but anyway, I'm slightly off the track. The Red Cross has a very, very demanding view of this. The United States Military Academy has a very permissive view of this. I shouldn't even say the Military Academy. The United States Law of War Manual, issued by the Department of Defense, has a very permissive view of this, and there's been a lot of commentary by scholars at West Point who say, no, Israel hasn't violated this at all. So now you have to ask, well, who should be more authoritative? People who have actually fought a lot of wars, or people who are sitting on the sidelines saying, like, I don't care who wins or not, but I just think, rules are really rules. Which is actually, seriously, you don't care who wins? I mean, then I don't want your advice. I mean, another good fact, it just is a good story, but in 1940, the Red Cross sent a communication to Prime Minister Churchill and said, now there's bombing going on in London and you've started bombing in Germany. We will verify on both sides. We'll try to keep track of how much damage there is so that both sides can avoid hurting civilians. And Churchill writes this note to his cabinet. He doesn't even ask for their opinion, he just informs them. I of course, rejected this offer immediately. At best, they will be, he says, there's some reason to think they will be pro-German because they're surrounded by German-occupied territory. But even if they were neutral, we do not now want advice from neutrals. Which is like, yes, if you're fighting a war. I think it's reasonable to say you want advice from people who have been in that situation. But that situation means you're sending your own people out to get killed. And you're taking responsibility for actual casualties in war. So that's serious and that's hard. And I'm really, really glad I never had to do that. I think lawyers for the Red Cross shouldn't get a lot of weight. But anyway, to sum up just quickly, there are different views about this. And I think we don't, it's not I think, I will state it as a fact. You can write it down. We do not live in a world in which one court in The Hague can say, this is the rule for all nations, we have said it, it is a thus saith the Lord. If you follow this law, everyone will say how wise and understanding you are to listen to the International Criminal Court. Like, this is totally preposterous. That's not the world we live in. And whatever you think about Israel, other countries will not feel bound by it, please, Rabbi.
You know, when I was young, when I first learned about the United Nations, I thought to myself, this is an amazing thing. The history of the world, all nations ever did is stick up for themselves and make war. This is kind of messy end.
Yes, it is.
Whenever I was,
yes, it is.
And you know, you outlined it, and it's pretty clear that in a certain way, it doesn't really have authority. There's an incredible absurdity and double standard about it. So I sort of wonder, is it a step sort of in the right direction, or is it just so absurd that it's a game and we shouldn't even play it?
This is a really, really fair question. During the UN drafting conference in San Francisco in 1945, a bunch of small states said, wait, it's really not fair that the 5 great powers, as they consider themselves, get to have a veto. And Senator Vandenberg, who was the Republican there to win Republican support for this, he gave a speech to them, and he said, it's okay if you want to have an organization in which a whole bunch of states participate and then the majority vote is binding on all the rest, you should make that organization and live with it. The United States is not joining it. I don't actually think Britain or France or the Soviet Union will join it. It happens that we have the overwhelming preponderance of military force, but you have your own organization, good luck. And in real life, every single occasion, there aren't many of them, I think there's 3, in which the Security Council has agreed, yes, we authorize force on behalf of the United Nations. What that actually meant was American force. Because other countries are not rushing to volunteer. They don't have a lot of force. And even if they have a lot of troops, they don't have the capacity to move them into position, which we do, to move them quickly and supply them at a great distance. So this is, we want American force, but the other countries will vote on how it is to be used. No, I mean, it doesn't even matter what I think. I think there's no chance the Congress of the United States would ever accept that. And what's true for us is at least equally true for Russia and for China. So this is, what they did as a compromise was, okay, if all of the most powerful countries agree, then the UN can do something. And it just turns out that's the utopian part of it. If they all agree, well, they mostly don't agree. And then you have to step back and ask yourself, is that surprising? I mean, in the history of the world, they didn't actually agree very much. Why would you think after the advent of communism in Russia, there'd be more in agreement? I mean, it was, Yes, aspirational, people sometimes say. So I'm not leading up to, it was a terrible mistake and we must kick it out of the United States, although I'm open to that. I just mean to say, it's a little bit crazy to say, okay, the UN is dysfunctional, but these institutions on the side, they are authoritative. That can't be right. And if I didn't make this clear, let me say it in one sentence. I think what has actually happened here is that the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court are basically playing to the majority in the General Assembly. They're doing like the popular thing. And it is easier to do because they perfectly well understand that this is not immediately going to be implemented by anyone, so they don't have to take responsibility for, oh no, we created a disaster. They are viewing this, which in a certain way is understandable, as a kind of impressive gesture, an impressive admonition, and then you like work it out. If you actually read International Court of Justice decisions, the most common result is that they don't remand it to a lower court as our Supreme Court does, because there is no lower court. So they say, okay, now the parties should like work out a settlement that is consistent with what we have said. They understand perfectly well they cannot actually like be in charge of making peace. Right? So I think they have really overstepped themselves. I think it's going to hurt them. But whether a whole lot of countries agree or not that, oh, they've overstepped, they just aren't in a position to stamp their foot and say, now this is the law and everyone must obey. I'll bring it all down to one quick statement. We used to have this statement, this slogan, tell it to the Marines. I just want to say to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, tell it to President Trump. I'm not saying like President Trump is wiser than they are, but they won't likely persuade him. So this is not happening just because you said it was international law. International law cannot be simply what they say the first time out. Now, please, yeah,
Yes,
Gary.
Two questions. Could you briefly talk about how the international consensus about the legitimacy of Israel switched
Yeah.
from San Remo to Resolution 242 to Zionist racism to where we are today? And the second question is, which is totally unrelated to the first, is why was it, now that we've heard all the things that you've said, that the League of Nations failed?
Oh, let me do the second one, because that's just like real easy. Because Hitler said, well, the League of Nations, it's ridiculous, I don't care. Okay, that was over. And I'll add, when he invaded Poland, this is a good thing to tell you, when he invaded Poland, Britain and France said, okay, that's it, this means war, and they didn't go back to the League of Nations. It was just like, this is really serious. This is no time for the League of Nations. I was once on a panel, it was years ago, and I said this very thing. When Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France went to war. They didn't consult the League of Nations. And there was a guy sitting next to me who is now the foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski. And he said, excuse me, they did not go to war. They declared war. That is very different. And that was a really good point. And it goes back to, it's the law that the righteous do not enforce. It might have made a difference if Britain and France had tried to invade Germany in 1939. Instead, they said, whoa, a lot of people would get hurt. That'd be dangerous. Probably Hitler will have second thoughts. Let's not rush this. And there was no one to tell them, okay, now this is what you have to do. And to bring this to, everything in the Middle East, there's like, the outside world is not offering to step in and do anything. So of course the League failed because it was basically based on the idea that everyone would feel honor bound or shamed or something to go along with the league, and that was fantastical. Now, just remind me of the first question. Oh, the whole history of this, what changed, yeah. This actually has a short answer also, which is if you go back to 1922 or whenever it is that the league says, oh yeah, the Balfour Declaration, that's what you're talking about, why they embraced that. It's San Remo. It's a very different membership. I mean, it's basically nice countries in Europe. It wasn't even the Soviet Union. It wasn't even Germany, let alone all these, what we later would call third world countries. So it's basically Britain, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, you know, they all said like, oh yeah, this would be a nice thing to do. And if you jump ahead 50 years to the mid-1970s, you've now got a lot of Muslim countries in the UN. You've got a lot of third world countries. They're not Muslim, but they like to be on the same team. And there they feel humiliated or angry or aggrieved. And the Soviet Union is like, yeah, right? So it's a different world. And I really hope this is not a controversial statement. I don't think there was anything that Israel really could have done differently that would have altered that. Particularly in 1975, people have been saying in recent decades, Israel should make this concession or this offer, and like, okay, I don't claim to have opinions on this that are worth your hearing from me. I mean, I don't know. But I know that in 1975, the position of Arab countries was, we will not negotiate, we will not recognize, no. So I don't think there was anything they could have done in 1975 that would have changed that. Yeah.
Let me do one more question, then we can go downstairs, there's dessert and drinks, and you can ask the rest of
Are you almost too optimistic?
Have you looked this up yet? About
A second.
Send me an email.
Are you all too optimistic?
I will stand up in shul and say,
No, I'm sure you're right.
I'll do shuva for this. I mean, but I'm not.
In that there is a feedback loop, even if international law.
Yes.
Which is that if the election had gone slightly differently,
Yes.
and if, the
Correct.
next Secretary of State,
Correct.
or the next president had been somebody who took an international
So
law class from somebody else
Yes.
at a different school, and a lot of senators in the last couple of days basically said this was, oh well, Israel must be. There actually are real effects.
Yes.
And I worry that maybe you're just too sanguine.
No, this is very well taken. Yes, I mean, this is not without potential harm. But people shouldn't feel like Israel's doomed because these international institutions have said bad things. I mean, we would have had to fold up many decades ago if that were the case. And I take your point also that Western support is not as strong as it used to be. Although even there, I think people are a bit alarmist about this. I mean, I check in with Mark Mellon every week. Most of the Democrats are mostly supportive of Israel, and almost all the Republicans are strongly supportive of Israel. And, like, we think that it used to be better, but it used to be better at a time when it didn't cost anything to support Israel. So compared to any other country, America's still, like, pretty solid. But even in Europe, there's a lot of support for Israel, and there's a lot of, what has happened in the past year, I take your point, is in some way, potentially threatening to Israel, but these things go both ways. A lot of people in Europe find it really upsetting to have mobs running around screaming, and particularly upsetting to have the mobs saying more or less Nazi slogans, which everybody in Europe is committed to saying that could never happen again. We didn't even support it when we did it. We certainly don't agree with it now. They're upset by that. They are upset by that. And they're particularly upset if you say from the river to the sea, you've put on the table, okay, since the 1990s, we've been pretending that this is about the occupied territories. But now the mask is dropped, and we're admitting, okay, it's not actually about the occupied territories. It's about the whole thing. It's about Israel. There's no version of self-government in Gaza that Hamas was ready to accept, even if you throw in East Jerusalem, right? And this is really out in the open now. And I think they did delude themselves because it was convenient to delude themselves over many decades. And in fairness to them, they weren't thinking about Hamas. They were thinking about Arafat and Abu Mazen, and like, it seemed like maybe it was, so I think we're in a world now in which, yes, there's some anxiety that supporting Israel is costly, but there's also anxiety that pressing concessions on Israel could be really dangerous in a way they hadn't understood in the 1990s. So I don't think it's true that when you add it all up, like, oh, Israel is like on the edge of the cliff. I think Israel has a lot more going for it than we often appreciate from sort of who makes the most noise. And just one last thing. I think people in Western countries do have this sense, which they had in the 1970s, like Israel is a Western country. If it is overwhelmed, this is a terrible defeat for the West. I think it means more than that for all kinds of reasons to people in Europe. I mean, they're post-Christian, you know, but still they're like, I think they have a sense that the stakes of this are really quite high, if that's what we're talking about. So I don't think they're really in a mood to say, yes, let's strangle Israel's economy to show our fidelity to the International Court of Justice. No. And nobody's really said that. I mean, they're really kind of mumbling at this point. Yeah. So, is there anything good at the drinks downstairs?
Let's go sing.
You should all drink to the revocation of the arrest warrants. May that be speedily fulfilled.
Amen.